So Paul Polman was Chief Executive Officer of Unilever from 2009 to 2019, where he led the way in showing how businesses can profit through purpose. You delivered some significant returns while making Unilever a global leader in sustainability. And today you work across a range of organizations delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you're also an active investor, so putting into practice some of the net positive concepts that you've written so much about and that we have a book signing on later. So I want to welcome you, Paul, for joining us. I want to start by asking you a little bit about what are the challenges at hand. So sustainability is a systemic challenge that can be extremely complex. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the toughest challenges that business are facing in sort of reconciling some of the short-term incentives and requirements with the long-term needs of sustainability?
Yeah, and it's probably there. I think the first thing to start with is that we are moving. So it's not a question of rolling back or having difficulties investing. $1.8 trillion last year in green energy, up 50%. This year will be up 30, 40% again from that number, twice the level of what we invest in fossil fuel. Things are moving, but unfortunately the real challenge is, probably the main challenge is that we're dealing here with an exponential problem and we're moving at linear speed. That's really where the challenge is. And this comes at a time that the world is facing a lot of other challenges. I would argue because we haven't addressed the issues in the first place at the speed needed. You see inequality going up, you see the devastating effects of climate change now occurring to us on a daily basis, be it with Hurricane Helene in the US, or be it in Nepal, or be it in Bangladesh or Pakistan. It's now a daily, not even a news item anymore, regretfully. So where are the challenges for business and for society at large actually to make this transition or to accelerate this transition? Because we're really talking about having to go 3 to 4 times faster than we currently do. So the first one, I would say the bigger challenge right now, which is clear, is political inertia. There's a lot happening. Europe is setting the pace in many areas. You referred to the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, etc. They are fundamental pieces of legislation that will move things forward. But depending on an outcome in the US, you can derail quite a lot. It's the difference between the two candidates is probably close to the emission of Europe. So that these are important things. So political inertia, where the global system is gridlocked, where multilateral institutions that really should deal with this have a hard time functioning, where commitments are not met is probably the most difficult one. And it pulls business down to the here and now. If you talk to all of the CEOs, it's the AI challenges, it's the political challenges that they're dealing with. It's are probably getting more in the way of them doing the right thing long term. If there's no clear signal, no consistency of policy, it's very hard to unlock investments. And you see that a little bit happening in the US. IRA has played a big role, but if you look at the last year and a half with these uncertainties around the political climate, you don't get enough investments that are being unlocked. So the other challenges that we face are the normal ones. When you make a transition like this, and you move, there is a vested order that becomes louder, and you see that also in the US again, but also in other places in the world. So there is a pushback to some of these things that takes the ambition out at a time that we need more ambition. The technological challenges or the financial challenges which are there in some of the cases, which we should not belittle, but I want to put them in perspective. About 80% of the things we need to attack today can be done with technology and solutions that are available. And we just need to be a little bit more mature in how we work together to attack these issues. So I take the 20, but don't let the opposition make the 20 100, if you know what I mean. But 80% can be done if we would just work together a little bit differently. Which brings me to the final challenge that we have, is that courageous leadership of the business community, especially, to work together, to move from competitive leadership to cooperative leadership. Put the future of humanity first. That would be all served to do this, but yet collectively we fail miserably in actually doing it at the speed and scale needed.
Yeah. Obviously this need for accelerated timelines is critical. You mentioned a little bit about policy stability, and I'm struck by how different kind of scenarios for transition, sustainable transition, depend on that policy stability. But we've seen, I'd say, over the last 2 or 3 years, some pretty clear sort of environmental or economic headwinds to meeting some of the ambitions that corporations put forward 2 or 3 years ago. And even at, let's say, New York Climate Week a couple of weeks ago, it was clear that there was sort of a concern about whether there's pushback and slowdown and whether that concern is actually real or justified. Right. Is it?
Well, so on the one hand, you can sit here and have a story of desperation. And because climate change is going up, inequality is going up, we're only in 17% of the Sustainable Development Goals are on track. You can't sit here and say, oh my gosh, what is happening? And throw your hands up in the air. But frankly, that's not an attitude that leads to anything, to be honest. And it's not needed. We are, as I said, we are actually moving. We had in the UN last week, where I was the whole week, the Pact of the Future, where 193 countries came together at least and made a commitment to attack issues like the UN, multilateral institutions, finance mechanisms, climate change, enrolling the next generations more in these discussions. So having that commitment from 193 countries is there. We have the COP16, the biodiversity COP coming up in a few weeks in Colombia. We're moving forward on that. The 30 by 2030 agreement is an important one. We have the treaty, the plastics treaty that Inger Anderson is leading. Again, we see some movement there in a positive direction, the Treaty of the Ocean. So I could go on, and then at the same time we see some parts of the world moving rapidly into legislative environments, but collectively that's not enough. And so where we struggle is in that acceleration. And as this vested order becomes stronger, their voices become stronger, partly because the conversion is happening. $6 billion in the US goes into politics, $2 billion at local levels and $4 billion at national levels and at federal levels. And that money is basically going to lobbying of one sort or the other. You see this vested order becoming louder, and it's not going to change in the next 5 or 10 years as this transition happens. So we have to deal with it. But what we have clearly seen in the US, as many of the CEOs are sort of betting on both horses, that they're not willing to be as courageous, I would argue, than they should be. So less speaking up on what they actually do need for their business longer term, less willingness to form partnerships and collective action, which is now needed. The reality is any individual business alone can at best do 20% of what needs to be done. The other 80% needs to come from collective action now. If you tackle deforestation, plastics in the ocean, climate change. And this is where businesses struggle, including my former business, where they've set very aggressive objectives and say, we want to achieve this. But if the environment around it is not conducive enough to get there, then it's very difficult. So you see, not the backtracking, but you see probably, as I mentioned before, a little bit of a slowing down of ambition, which is equally regrettable at a time when we actually need more ambition. Yeah.
I mean, you talk about this collective action problem. We mentioned a few of the policy initiatives, particularly in Europe, like the CSRD and the CBAM. Yeah. Thinking about all this money that's spent on consultants and on process and on compliance, how do you think we can sort of address the requirements of those kinds of policies, or how can they be effective without just creating a lot of extra bureaucracy?
And that is right. If you now talk to most of the companies, regretfully, they will say my sustainability department has turned into a compliance department. Yeah. And some of these things are not consistent, they're not clear, information is missing. And yes, a whole industry of consultants is popping up trying to capitalize on that. But it causes confusion, and it is a box-ticking exercise for many companies now. So you have to start at the top, When I was running Unilever, we were actually actively pushing legislation because we were well ahead of the legislation. So we used that nearly as a competitive weapon to keep competition on their back foot, if you want to. And so we were fighting for things that the circular economy package was, at that time, we put that together, or the nature protection law that we have now, the Green Deal. And if you are, as a leader, ahead of things that are fairly obvious to predict that need to be done, you don't have to actually be worried about the legislation. You can start to think about how do you turn that into a competitive advantage and make your business actually benefit from that. And I think that's the first attitude. What do you take? Don't see it as risk mitigation, see it as opportunity. Don't see it as cost, but see it as an investment. Don't see it as a short-term, but as a longer-term value creation tool. And if you do that, you create a different culture in an organization. The second thing is that you need to be aware of your total impact that you have in the world. Quite rapidly, it's moving into what we would call in Europe extended producer responsibility. Scope 3 is a good example of that. California just yesterday, as Kevin, the governor, passed quite some extensive legislation that goes in the direction of Europe. Often California is setting a trend for the US. But it's all about more disclosure in your value chain. And that historically has been difficult for CEOs. Many think they can outsource their value chain and outsource their responsibility. Doesn't happen anymore. So if you do that proactively, set targets in line with science. Many CEOs really, frankly, they have such a short tenure that they are trying to survive with the crises that they have to deal with, but often their targets are not ambitious. I call them targets not to lose versus targets to win. So my third advice would be set real targets that science tells you so you become more ambitious. You might not achieve them all, but you certainly will end up in a better place than you otherwise would. And you don't have to worry too much about all that compliance in a certain sense because you're ahead of the curve. And it's, one of my life slogans is it's better to make the dust than eat the dust. I always think it's better to be ahead of a curve. That's fairly obvious.
Yeah, I mean, this whole idea of doing well by doing good is something I think we all want to believe in, but particularly given the headwinds that leaders have faced. I mean, I'm thinking about higher interest rates, supply chain difficulties, geopolitical turbulence. The mantra itself is not enough, right? So a lot of them are under pressure, whether it's from shareholders, whether it's from the board, to show where that doing well actually materializes. So how does, let's say internally to an organization, how does a leader build the support among stakeholders to really buy into this idea that there is value coming down the line?
I think the first challenge is to realize that all these challenges that we have are related. I don't have to tell you that. The fact that we have rising inequality is causing political polarization. The political polarization is stalemate in attacking some of these burning issues. Burning issues like climate change or biodiversity destruction cause, again, inequality by itself. So what we are facing today in the world is 80-90%, I would argue, has its own root cause. The second thing you have to realize that businesses have to put on the table is, if you don't act, what will your cost be? Often I hear people say, I have to invest so much to put my heat pumps in place when my coal plant still functions, type argument, or my car is still running, why should I go to an electric vehicle? But what is important that the leading businesses do understand that if they don't act, they will incur significantly higher costs. And you start to see that play out in society already. And that's very difficult also for politicians. So as a result, you have most of the CEOs and most of the politicians work on the symptoms, but not on the underlying causes. So we spend a lot of time educating our board. We spend a lot of time educating ourselves, educating the financial market to make clear that a little bit of a longer-term, more systemic approach would be better for the business over time. I was spending 10, 15 million a year in upgrading our tea plantations with drought-resistant bushes, with building new tea plantations. I could have given that money to the shareholders, would have looked a little bit more heroic short-term, but it's like a drug. Then they want more and more and more on another base, and you're actually killing the business over time. So you have to explain why you do that, so that in 5-10 years' time, you're in a much stronger position. We were spending 20-25 million a year on creating a market for sustainable palm oil. Wasn't quite successful the way we wanted it, but deforestation in Indonesia is down 70-80% over the last 5 years because of a lot of these efforts. You have to explain to them that is actually better for your business model now. So why do more and more companies make commitments to run their business in a water positive way or move to regenerative agriculture? Because it starts to make business sense. So the first thing is explain the cost that you're going to have in the future if you don't act. The second thing is really showing that these things are becoming increasingly investable opportunities. I'm actually surprised because of the speed of technology, mainly how many CEOs actually cannot keep up with that speed and are not aware of what can be done. individually or collectively. In Europe, we work with 70 fashion companies to change the fashion industry. It's about 30% of the fashion value chain, moving to things like regenerative cotton, green energy, getting out of single-use plastics, the more obvious things, and ultimately, hopefully, getting to the question of decoupling growth from resource use, labor standards. So there are some tougher, more salient issues to address. But we've created the biggest green energy buying alliance, where many of the companies are too small to really do that themselves, don't have the resources, don't know how to do it, but create these collectives. And where we see these collective actions, we see not only better results, but we see the economics work much faster for companies. So these buying coalitions, if you want to, or these first mover coalitions are important. This is probably where we see a little bit the pressure right now on the political level, that we've seen it in the insurance industry in the US or in the BlackRocks of this world. When the pressure comes up, they're less eager to participate in these collective actions, because some of these political fractions have positioned it wrongly so, if I may say, as collusion or against competitive law. They've never won any case like this. No law got passed, by the way, except 6 out of the 161 propositions. Texas is getting sued now for stealing out of their pension funds $500 million because of not looking at ESG factors, which is outright ludicrous. So it's not giving them anything, but it has made people more fearful to go into these cooperative partnerships, where in fact most of the answers are.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to, you talked a lot about scope 3 and building those partnerships. So that was something I wanted to talk about. But obviously doing that and sort of managing a value chain, looking at scope 3 emissions, a lot of that is a data problem and one that requires technologies. You mentioned a little bit the technologies that leaders might not be so aware of or might have to contend with. What are some of the technologies that you think are particularly interesting, particularly in that space of coordinating for the collective action problem among supply chains, the rest of it?
Yeah, so there are now more and more companies that have these digital twins. In the Netherlands, 09 Solutions would be one, Pulsera would be one, and I can mention, I mean, the landscape is full of them coming in, where increasingly with AI tools, you can actually do fairly predictive analysis of what your emissions are in your value chain. You're being helped actually by big companies, take the Salesforce or the Microsofts or the Unilevers or the Walmarts, making commitments of gigatons, taking gigatons out of their value chain, and they're willing to work in a fairly transparent way, often as a requirement also for their suppliers, to make that transparent so that you can take the proper actions. And when people say, I have a hard time understanding the transparency of my value chain, I have to laugh, to be honest, in most cases, because at the end of the day, do you want it or don't you want it? That's probably the biggest bottleneck right now. We had 3,500 economists on the payroll, and we knew the names of the 5 million smallholder farmers we were working with. We also knew the names of the 3 million more that we created jobs for. So we did 1.2 billion acts of hand washing with our Lifebuoy bar soaps to save lives and attack these issues of pneumonia, diarrhea that cost the lives of 5 million children a year still. We knew the names of these 1.2 billion children in the schools. So it's just a matter of are you interested or not? And can you set up these mechanisms to create that transparency? That's why it is so important to do source certified value chains. In Indonesia, we worked with 35,000 smallholder farmers because we were more interested in giving them the livelihood. So we traced it back to the source, created our own mills, our fractionation units, so that we control the value chain. We ran our own tea plantation. So I think if you really want to do it, and it is a little bit of an investment, but it's a smart investment, because increasingly you'll be held accountable, and more importantly, the citizens of this world want to know where it comes from.
Yeah.
I hate to go to Shein or Primark and be proud to have a $1 t-shirt or a $2 shirt and not know where it comes from. And I'm actually surprised each time I go to a store and I ask people, do you know where it comes from? They look at you as if you're from Mars. But that question will become more pertinent in the future for more and more citizens of this world. It's very clear to me.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the Walmart supply chain. We were happy to have the head of Walmart sustainability at our Sustainability Week in New York in the spring, and just discussed a little bit about the complexities of building those incentives within the supply chain. And also, I'd be remiss not to mention our value chain navigator. So even at the Economist Impact, we're building tools to help look into the value chain and understand that Scope 3 emissions. Let me ask you.
And by the way, people will forgive you on not being perfect. So we see too. So it's better to move and do the best you can. The world will forgive you for that.
Yep.
We weren't perfect either. We were missing data, but we did our best. So focus on doing things with the best that is available right now. Don't get stuck in, again, get to perfection. That would be the worst enemy of any of it.
Which again, I think is a bit of a cultural issue. This question of paralysis by analysis, or not moving until you're perfect, has caused a lot of
Or if you've done it, many CEOs sit there. On the left is a PR department, on the right is a legal department, and they're reading from a piece of paper, and and they say, "I'm not making any commitment until I've done it."
Yeah.
But that's not anymore what is how you can run a company in this fast-changing environment.
Let me just ask you a last question about financing. So you've written this book on net positive investment. Can you describe a little bit what that paradigm is, why it's necessary, and then maybe and then why people should go buy the book?
Well, they don't have to buy the book. I want them to change their mindsets. That's more important to me than buying the book, although we were number 3 on the Thinkers 50 list, and the book is selling very well in 14 countries. And it was the best-selling book for Harvard. But that's not my point. I'm not here to write a book to sell. I'm here to change a mindset, and that's the most important thing. But it's different from your finance question, so let me handle them both very quickly. On the financing side, first of all, and then I'll get in the book, we need just on the energy transition $3 to $5 trillion more per year than we currently do, and that money is not being unlocked. There are 48 countries in Africa that are virtually bankrupt right now. They have more debt service than they spent on healthcare or other things. So most of the growth in the future is actually going to be in the 80% of the world, which we call developing markets. And finance clearly isn't flowing. So the first thing we're working on is an initiative, it's called the Bridgestone Initiative, is to get the IMF and the World Bank to operate differently, and then multilateral finance institutions to actually not finance projects directly, but to move increasingly in the direction of what we call blended finance, where you take first loss currency risk. We're blending that in with philanthropic money. We've set up in the Rockefeller Foundation, and I'm on the board, a 10 billion fund, which is called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, to attack about the energy poverty of 600 million people in a sustainable way. So when you create this catalytic funding, you can leverage it up 10, 12 times. And as a result, we're now retiring coal plants in the Philippines or in Indonesia. We're helping energy transitions in places as far away as Malawi. So we unlock that money. And private sector is then willing to come in. It's a risk-return equation that you need to work. So that's on the financing side, probably the most important thing that the world is currently doing. Money will not come from the governments anymore in the developed markets. This COP in Azerbaijan will be a very difficult COP. It's what's called the finance COP. But it will be difficult because it's in a country that's on the bottom of human rights violations, corruption, and I don't know why they got the COP. It's really a wrong signal, to be honest. And it's 95% of their economy is fossil fuel, and they increasingly think it's going to be more in the future. So it's a destructive force, not a constructive force. But financing will be on the agenda, will be a difficult discussion. What we're trying to do with net positive is really on the premise that when governments don't work, when multilateral institutions don't quite function the way they were designed, we need to have responsible business step up, fill that void. You don't need many, you need 10, 15% of the business community to create tipping points. You need Elon Musk to create a tipping point in the car industry. We see tipping points in batteries, we saw it in solar and wind. So how do you create these tipping points? By having the private sector step up, then enroll obviously civil society, which is not that difficult anymore, to de-risk that political process. That's really, ultimately you need these government frameworks in place to be successful. So the premise of the book is very simple. World Overshoot Day this year was August the 1st. which is the day that we use up more resources than the planet can replenish. I would argue after that date, where every day after that we're stealing from future generations. 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries that the Resilience Institute in Stockholm, Johan Rockström and others have identified as the planetary health systems are beyond their acceptable boundaries. As I sit here, we're losing another 2 million species. We've lost 68% of the species in the last 50 years. The question is, when is it our turn more than anything else? Hubert Reeves, who was a philosopher in Canada, said it very well when he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. So the premise of the book is a very simple premise. When we've overshot these planetary boundaries to such an extent, doing less bad is not good enough anymore. It's still bad. My plane comes down less fast than your plane is not a good thing. Or I killed 10 people, I'm a bad murderer, now I only kill 5 people, I'm a better murderer, it doesn't work. And yet if you read all the CSR reports, 95% of the companies issue them now, it talks about a little less carbon in the atmosphere, a little less plastics in the oceans, a little less deforestation in my value chain. So what we say is for companies that really want to position themselves better for this more equitable, more inclusive, greener future, versus this horrible brown past that we cannot afford anymore, the companies that want to position themselves well need to think regenerative, restorative, reparative. And that is what you increasingly see happening in the leading companies in the world. The food companies, how do you accelerate regenerative agriculture? They're spending about 8 to 10 billion on that now themselves. Working together to get governments in the right frameworks to get there. The IRA in the US with Tom Vilsack, we succeeded in getting about $40 billion in conversion to regenerative agriculture, and the US is leading in a lot of these things as a result of that. So what you then get is, how do these companies need to behave to become net positive? And there we say very simply, first thing we talked briefly is take responsibility of your total impact in the world. If you break it, you own it. Secondly, run your business for the multiple stakeholders. If you want to be around long term, be sure that all your stakeholders are satisfied. Thirdly, see shareholder return only as a result of what you do. It's important, but it's not the main reason for being. Fourthly, work the broader partnerships. And last but not least, work on what we call positive advocacy versus lobbying. Positive advocacy means working together on getting the right framework in place to succeed. So these are the characteristics of net positive companies, and what we can show each time more that companies that operate in that philosophy, ESG funds that operate with that philosophy, are also seeing significantly higher returns. That the economic forces are increasingly driving you that way, and that is encouraging. So
it's heartening and encouraging to see that finally that there is a return on these kind of efforts.
Absolutely. If there is hope in the world, because I want to end on a high note in that sense, it's that technology moves faster than we think. Cost of inaction is now higher than the cost of action in nearly any area that we look at. So it becomes the biggest opportunity that we've ever invented, in my opinion. And then the signals are increasingly overwhelming if you look at the younger generations, etc. I mean, you'd be daft not to want to position your company for the future.
No. Well, I'm really happy to end that conversation on a note of opportunity. And I mean, you're not the first to say that this presents sort of one of the biggest opportunities for value creation since the Industrial Revolution. So the opportunities and the chances for building are there. Paul Polman, thank you so much for joining me today. Yes. Thank you.